I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. My son leaned in close to my daughter and said it low, confident, already decided. Soon this house and everything else will be ours. He didn't look around. He didn't lower his voice out of fear. My daughter didn't question him. She nodded once, slow and certain. No surprise. No hesitation. That's when it hit me. They weren't waiting for my permission. They weren't even waiting for me to die. They were waiting for me to disappear. I stayed where I was after that, long enough for the house to settle back into its usual sounds. The refrigerator hummed. A floorboard clicked as it cooled. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. They moved like people who already knew the layout of a place they didn't own yet. I didn't confront them. I didn't cough or clear my throat. I let them believe they were alone with their certainty. At dinner, nothing was said. My son talked about property taxes like he'd always done, calm and detached, as if numbers were weather. My daughter asked if I'd signed the medical release for the new doctor. Practical things. Necessary things. I answered when spoken to and kept my eyes on my plate. The food tasted the same. That was the strangest part. Everything else felt tilted, but the routine held. That night, I walked the house slower than usual. I touched the doorframe where my wife once marked the kids' heights in pencil. I stood in the kitchen where we'd counted change to make rent. I'd thought those memories were anchors. I realized then they were evidence. Proof that I'd built something solid enough for others to plan around. Sleep didn't come easy. Not from fear, exactly. From recognition. I'd mistaken quiet for respect. Their patience wasn't love. It was timing. I lay there listening to the furnace kick on and off, thinking about how authority doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. It gets spoken around instead of spoken to. In the morning, my son asked if I'd considered downsizing. He said it gently, like advice. My daughter added that stairs were a risk. They watched my face for resistance and didn't find it. I nodded and said I'd think about it. That seemed to satisfy them. They weren't in a hurry anymore. They believed the direction was set. After they left, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold. The house felt larger, not smaller. Empty in a way it hadn't before. I understood then that whatever came next wouldn't announce itself. It would arrive through forms and conversations I wasn't invited into. And if I stayed silent much longer, silence would be taken as consent. The pressure didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces small enough to ignore if I wanted to. A pamphlet from a senior living community left on the counter. A sticky note on the fridge reminding me to take my pills, even though I'd never missed a dose. My daughter started speaking for me on phone calls, stepping in before I finished a sentence. She smiled while she did it, like she was helping. They began correcting my memory. Not harshly. Casually. That's not how it happened, Dad. You're mixing things up. At first, I laughed it off. I knew what I remembered. But repetition has weight. After a while, I caught myself pausing before answering, checking my own thoughts the way you check a map you no longer trust. Friends stopped calling. I didn't hear why, not directly. Just little comments that slipped through. People worry about you. You know how things get talked about. My son suggested it might be better if he handled my finances. Just to simplify things. He already had spreadsheets ready. Clean. Organized. Final looking. One afternoon, a neighbor I'd known for years asked if I was feeling alright. She said she'd heard I'd had a scare. I asked her what kind. She hesitated, then said she wasn't sure. That's when I understood how it worked. No accusation. Just concern. No lies you could point to. Just questions that lingered. At home, decisions were being made in rooms I wasn't in. Contractors came by to assess things. My daughter walked them through the house with a clipboard. I followed behind like a guest. When I asked what it was for, she said, planning. She didn't say whose. I started keeping quiet on purpose. I wanted to see how far they'd go without resistance. The answer was further than I'd expected. They spoke about timelines. About what made sense. About what was best. They never said my name in those conversations. Not when they thought I couldn't hear. Late at night, I sat with the lights off, listening to the house breathe. I thought about how easy it is to rewrite a man's life when you still use his furniture. How quickly love becomes logistics. I wasn't angry yet. I was still measuring the damage. And I was beginning to see that whatever they were building, it didn't include me standing upright in it. It became easier for them once I stopped pushing back. Silence gave them confidence. My son started keeping a notebook by his chair, writing things down when I spoke, as if my words needed record keeping. My daughter scheduled appointments without asking me first, then told me afterward like it was already settled. I moved it up, she'd say. It made more sense. They talked about my wife more than they ever had when she was alive. Not memories. Just references. What she would have wanted. What she'd say if she could see things now. I didn't correct them. I knew what she would have said. She would have told them to look me in the eye. They never did. Paperwork appeared. Authorization forms. Advance directives. I read every line. Nothing illegal. Nothing obvious. Just a steady transfer of control dressed up as care. When I asked questions, my son sighed. Not angry. Tired. Like I was slowing him down. We're just trying to help, he said. You don't have to make this harder. At church, people smiled differently. Longer pauses before speaking. A hand on my arm that lingered a second too long. Someone asked if I still drove. Someone else asked if I felt safe at home. The words were kind. The implication wasn't. I began to understand how a man can lose his footing without ever falling. One afternoon, I found a folder on the desk labeled Next Steps. Inside were estimates, listings, timelines. The house was already described in past tense. When I asked my daughter about it, she didn't deny it. She just said, "We thought you knew." That was her answer for everything by then. I stopped leaving the house much. Not because I couldn't. Because I was being watched. Every choice I made felt like it would be evaluated later. Used. Interpreted. I could feel my life narrowing to a version that fit their plans. At night, I thought about how trust erodes. Not through shouting or slammed doors, but through quiet revisions. Through being spoken over, then spoken for, then spoken about. I was still there. Still breathing. Still thinking clearly. But in their story, I was already becoming someone else. And I knew that if I didn't say something soon, that version would be the only one anyone remembered. The shift from private pressure to public consequence happened without ceremony. A letter arrived from a legal office I didn't recognize. Polite language. Neutral tone. It said concerns had been raised. It said an evaluation was being recommended, just to be safe. I read it twice, then set it on the table where my son would see it when he came by that evening. He didn't look surprised. He said it was a precaution. Something his advisor suggested. He said people worry when they see changes. I asked him what changes he meant. He didn't answer directly. He talked about stress. About grief that never really leaves. About how hard it must be to let go. Let go of what, he didn't say. My daughter stopped using my name around other people. She called me Dad when we were alone, but in company I became him. He's having a rough patch. He gets confused when he's tired. I stood there listening to myself described like a weather condition. Temporary. Inconvenient. Manageable. Rumors reached me the way smoke does. Not visible, but unmistakable. A cousin asked if I'd been angry lately. A friend asked if I remembered a conversation we'd never had. Someone mentioned that my son was stepping up, that it was good of him. I nodded and thanked them. It was easier than correcting a story already moving on without me. The house started to feel like a stage set. Familiar, but no longer mine. My chair had been moved to make room for something more accessible. Drawers were reorganized. Papers disappeared. When I asked where they'd gone, my daughter said they were safer now. She didn't say safe from what. One afternoon, I overheard my son on the phone. He was calm. Measured. He said the situation was delicate, but under control. He said they were being patient. That word again. Patient. As if I were something to wait out. I looked at my hands then. Steady. Familiar. Hands that had signed paychecks and school forms and hospital consent papers. Hands that had built this house with weekends and overtime. Nothing about them felt unreliable. But I understood something important in that moment. Once doubt is introduced, truth has to fight harder to be believed. I folded the letter from the lawyer and put it in my pocket. I wasn't ready to respond yet. I needed to decide whether I was still being managed, or if I was already being erased. The evaluation was scheduled without my consent. A weekday morning, chosen for convenience. Not mine. A letter followed with directions and a time, already confirmed. My daughter said she'd drive me. My son said it would look better if we cooperated. That word again. Better for who, he didn't say. At the clinic, they spoke to me slowly. Not unkindly. Just carefully. As if clarity were fragile. The doctor asked about dates, names, routines. I answered without trouble. Still, I could feel the narrative pressing in from the edges. My son filled the silences. My daughter offered context I hadn't asked for. I realized then that truth wasn't the goal. Consistency was. As long as their version stayed intact, details didn't matter. A week later, another letter arrived. This one mentioned temporary measures. Oversight. Safeguards. Language designed to sound reasonable. I was advised not to make major decisions alone. Not to handle large sums. Not to travel without notice. It wasn't a ruling. It was a recommendation. Enough to change how people treated me. The bank manager started asking my son questions instead of me. The pharmacist called my daughter to confirm refills. A neighbor offered to bring meals. I thanked her and watched the sympathy settle in her eyes. I hadn't told her anything. She already knew enough. At church, someone took my keys, just in case. I let them. I wanted to see what resistance would cost me. The answer came quickly. My son reminded me that pushing back could raise concerns. My daughter said stress wasn't good for my condition. I asked her which condition she meant. She said I was being difficult. The house was no longer quiet. It buzzed with planning. Emails. Calls. People I didn't know using my address like a reference point. I found out the house had been discussed with an agent. Just exploratory, they said. Nothing final. But the photos had already been taken. One afternoon, a letter from a distant relative arrived, asking if I was all right. She'd heard things. I folded it and put it away. I didn't have the strength to correct every whisper. Reputation doesn't collapse loudly. It thins out until there's nothing solid left to defend. That night, I sat alone in the living room, lights off, listening to my children talk in the kitchen. Their voices were low and steady. Confident. They were discussing timelines again. Not with anger. With relief. As if the hardest part was over. I understood then that the real damage wasn't the paperwork or the rumors. It was the way my absence was already being practiced while I was still in the room. The call came from someone I didn't know. A woman with a calm voice who said she was following up. She said my family had expressed concern. She asked if I felt safe. I said yes. She asked if I felt pressured. I said no. She paused, then asked if I understood why she was calling. I told her I did. That seemed to disappoint her. After that, people stopped asking me questions directly. Decisions arrived already shaped. I was informed, not consulted. My son took over the mail, said it was easier. My daughter began answering my phone. When I reached for it, she said, "I've got it," like I was reaching for a hot pan. The house showed up online one morning. Not officially listed. Just a preview. Coming soon. My name wasn't on it. The photos were flattering. Bright. Empty. They'd removed my chair from the living room before taking them. I noticed because my back remembered where it used to be. A friend from work came by unannounced. He looked uncomfortable standing in the doorway. Said he'd heard I wasn't doing well. I asked who told him that. He hesitated, then said my son had mentioned it. Out of concern. I watched my friend's eyes search my face for confirmation. I gave him none. He left with a promise to call. He didn't. I stopped correcting people altogether. Every denial sounded defensive. Every explanation sounded confused. Silence, at least, stayed neutral. I spent my days reading old manuals from jobs I'd done decades earlier. Things I knew by heart. It helped remind me who I was when no one was watching. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to my son, care of my house. It was from an attorney. I read it before handing it over. It discussed next steps if cooperation became an issue. That word again. Cooperation. As if my existence were a negotiation. That night, I sat across from my children and asked them a simple question. When did this become necessary? They looked at each other before answering. My daughter said they'd been worried for a while. My son said it wasn't personal. That it was about the future. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just listened. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. They weren't doing this out of panic or fear. They were doing it because it was efficient. Once I saw that, the last piece of confusion fell away. The accusation didn't come wrapped in anger. It came wrapped in concern. My son said someone had suggested it might be better to formalize things. Just in case. My daughter said it would protect everyone. Especially me. They used words like capacity and liability. Words that turn a man into a risk. A formal complaint was filed. Not dramatic. Just a statement of concern. It said I'd been resistant. That I'd withdrawn. That I'd shown signs of confusion and agitation. I read it carefully. None of it was false enough to fight cleanly. All of it was slanted just enough to stand. An investigator came by the house. Polite. Efficient. She asked me about my routines. About my children. About money. I answered plainly. She nodded and wrote things down. When my son spoke, she wrote more. When my daughter spoke, she stopped writing and listened. That's when I knew whose words carried weight now. After that, invitations stopped. I wasn't asked to meetings about my own life. Updates arrived secondhand. I was told what had been decided. The phrase, "for now," appeared often, as if permanence needed softening. I learned my reputation had shifted from reliable to delicate. From respected to monitored. A notice came from the county. A hearing, they called it. A review. I was advised not to attend alone. My son offered to handle it. I said no. He looked surprised, then disappointed. My daughter said it would look combative. I said I wasn't trying to look like anything. At the hearing, they spoke about me like I wasn't there. They spoke about patterns. About risk management. About outcomes. I spoke once. Briefly. I said I understood their concerns. I said I also understood what was being taken from me. The room went quiet for a moment. Then it moved on. The decision wasn't final. But it leaned in their favor. Temporary oversight. Continued monitoring. Language that suggested inevitability. When we left, my son put a hand on my shoulder and said this was for the best. I didn't shrug it off. I just stepped forward so his hand fell away on its own. Back home, I sat in the empty living room. The house was quieter than ever. Not peaceful. Expectant. I realized I'd become a problem to be solved. A variable to be controlled. And once a man is reduced to that, dignity becomes negotiable. That night, I made a list. Not of demands. Of facts. What I still controlled. What I didn't. What could still be decided by me alone. It wasn't much. But it was enough to remind me of something important. They could manage my life. They couldn't live it for me. I didn't confront them after that. There was nothing left to confront. The machinery was already running, and it didn't need my agreement to keep moving. What I did instead was sit with the truth of it, without trying to soften it or explain it away. That took longer than I expected. One evening, my daughter came into the room and asked if I needed anything. Her voice was careful. Practiced. I told her no. She lingered, like she was waiting for a different answer, then said they were just trying to keep things from getting complicated. I asked her when my life had become complicated for them. She didn't respond. She just nodded and left the room. I started sorting through my things quietly. Not packing. Just deciding. Papers I no longer needed. Tools I hadn't used in years. Photographs I chose to keep within reach. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to understand what still belonged to me. One afternoon, my son sat across from me and explained the next steps again. Slower this time. Like repetition might make it kinder. I listened until he finished, then asked him a question I'd been holding on to. When did you stop seeing me as your father? He looked at the floor. He said that wasn't fair. I told him fairness had already left the room. There was no apology. Just discomfort. That was answer enough. That night, I sat alone and thought about authority. How it changes shape. How it doesn't always announce when it's gone. Sometimes it just moves into someone else's hands while you're still holding on to the idea that it's yours. I wasn't angry. I was clear. They believed they were doing the right thing. I believed that too, once. The difference was I finally understood that belief doesn't protect you from harm. It just makes it easier to justify. When I went to bed, I slept. Not deeply, but honestly. And when I woke, I knew there was only one part left to this story. Not a reversal. Not a victory. Just an ending that I could live with, even if it wasn't the one I'd earned. The house sold quietly. No sign out front. No open houses. A transaction handled the way everything else had been, behind my back but within my walls. I was told afterward, like a courtesy. My son said it would make things simpler. My daughter said it would reduce stress. Neither asked how it felt to watch the place you'd built become an asset you no longer occupied. I moved into a smaller place across town. Clean. Efficient. Nothing wrong with it. The furniture fit because there wasn't much to bring. The walls were bare because I didn't feel like filling them yet. For the first few weeks, I kept expecting someone to tell me what came next. No one did. Their work was done. They visited less once everything was settled. There was nothing left to manage. No decisions to redirect. I understood then that my usefulness to them had ended the moment control was secured. There was no cruelty in it. Just completion. I learned to live inside my days again. Slow mornings. Walks without explanation. Coffee I didn't have to rush through. People spoke to me directly here. Not kindly out of obligation. Just normally. Like a man who still belonged to himself. Sometimes I thought about confronting them one last time. Saying everything I hadn't said. Then I realized it wouldn't land the way I wanted. They'd already filed me away in their minds. Old. Difficult. Resolved. No speech was going to change that. What surprised me was the absence of hatred. I felt disappointment, yes. A deep one. But hatred requires a kind of energy I no longer had to spare. I needed what was left for myself. I still see my children on holidays. We're polite. Careful. The air between us stays calm because we don't ask it to carry anything heavier. They believe they did what was necessary. I believe they did what was convenient. Both can be true. I've learned something late in life. Love doesn't always break loudly. Sometimes it fades into planning meetings and reasonable decisions. Sometimes the people who know you best become the ones who explain you away. I live quietly now. Not hidden. Just unclaimed. And there is a strange peace in that. When no one is waiting for you to disappear, you're finally free to stay.